Let's talk about how your podcast looks to your audience. Now you may be thinking, Sunny, looks? How does my podcast look to my audience? They hear my podcast. Yes, but that is not their first impression of your show. Their first impression is your podcast artwork. That's what we call it. That is the graphic that is associated with your podcast. And it's very important that you nail this, because if you don't get past the graphic, you may not get people listening to your show, because we're window shopping. We go to whatever our favorite podcasting app is, and we kind of mindlessly just start scrolling through the podcasts. And the first thing that catches our attention is the artwork. So my first tip for you when it comes to podcast artwork is, unless you are a designer, do not do your own podcast artwork. Leave it to the professionals. This is too important of a decision to mess up because you want to save a few bucks. So let's take a look. I want to show you some samples of artwork so I can point out what works and what doesn't work. There are a few things, a few rules to live by when it comes to podcast artwork. Are you ready? The first is, does it draw your attention? It should be screaming to people, listen to me, listen to me. It needs to stand out in a crowd, so that's the first one. The second, is it scalable? What do I mean by scalable? Well, when I see your podcast artwork on my iPhone, the artwork is really, really small. But if I were to listen to your podcast on my Apple TV, now it's huge because I got a pretty big TV, right? And so your podcast artwork has to look good, super duper small, and it needs to look good on a big old TV. And I know that's not really fair, but that's the kind of world we're living in, right? The artwork has to be scalable. So you really need to watch any kind of text that you're using. Do not use super small print. Do not use fonts that can be very confusing. Keep it simple. Next, is your podcast name super clear? That should be front and center. That should be what draws people in. You have your image, which may draw people initially. The second thing they should be looking at is the name of your podcast, not who's ever in the show or hosted by. That's not what you want them to see. You want them to see the image. Aha, that's beautiful. What show is this? Boom. That is your podcast name. So make sure that is super clear. Next, does your artwork include the word podcast? Next, does your podcast name and your artwork include the word podcast? If it does, take it out. I don't know what it is, but when people start podcasts, they automatically want to brand it as a podcast. What happens, or what would happen if when you went to a store, every store you went to said the name of the store and then store afterward? Like, it would have to clarify, I am a store. JCPenney, store. Sears, store. I mean, it's so redundant. It's like, I know that's a store. When people are accessing your podcast, they're doing it through a podcast app. So they know it's a podcast because that's why they're there, to listen to podcasts. So you are really wasting time and space to use the word podcast. Now, I will also say that Apple recently cracked down, and they said if you are using the word podcast in your artwork or in your title, you may not be featured on Apple because they basically don't like people using that word. So if you needed another reason to not use the word podcast, there you go. All right, you ready to take a look at some of this artwork? Because some of it's pretty darn good. Okay, so I just logged into Apple Podcasts. This is the desktop app. And anything that is featured is gonna be good artwork. So if you're looking for ideas, this is a great place to start. And I just wanna point out some of the things that we're seeing here. Joe Rogan has had the #1 podcast for a really long time. Obviously, this really grabs people's attention. It's his face. They know exactly who is part of this show. This is the Joe Rogan experience. So there's no denying that. Let's move on. Wind of change. Now with this, you don't necessarily know what the podcast is about, but this image is very appealing. It's coming together. It represents a person. It does intrigue me. And again, the podcast title is very much legible. It also has some smaller information. I believe this is the network it belongs to. And that is not scalable, but that's also not super important to their artwork. And I think they purposely made this more of a tannish color because it's not as important for people to notice. Next one, motive for murder. I can tell exactly what this is about. You've got the red in the background, kind of looks like blood. I know the NBC logo, and I know this is part of Dateline. So there's not a ton of information on this, but it's very impactful. Let's see, the Daily. So this is something from the New York Times. You can see the logo here in the bottom. This is a very simple blend, right? It's just a simple blend of colors. It doesn't really tell me what the podcast is about. It's just called the Daily, but it obviously works for them because they're in the top 5 podcasts right now on the top charts. And same with this, very simple. It's called Unlocking Us. I know that because that's the biggest text on the artwork. We've got a key right here, and it looks like Brene Brown is the host of this. So if you wanted to add things like, your name, you could certainly do that. You could do that under the name of the podcast. This is still very scalable, and it's just easily understood. But these are the top podcasts. What would happen if we did a search? And I'm just going to type in parents. Let's see what pops up when I type in the word parents, because we're probably going to get some things that don't quite fit our rules here. So we have Parents Tip of the Day, and we know this is Parents Magazine because the same font that Parents Magazine uses. We see a little pacifier up here. That makes perfect sense. It does pop. It's got a nice background in the back, so that works. Let's find one that might be more difficult. Let's go over to this. Hot Marriage, Cool Parents. Well, that is a really cool image. That may grab people's attention because that's just kind of a fun image, but take a look down here. Look how hard this is to read. It says with Jamie Otis and Doug, I'm not even sure what the last name is. So I realize that may not be the most important part of the artwork, but I think this could have been reworked a little bit. On this page, which podcast artwork pops out the most to you? Now we may have some different answers here, but if I were looking at this, I would say Parent Trapped. Parent Trap seems to pop the most for me. And it's because you have a bright, solid background, and my eye is just drawn to that. Plus it has these little lines popping out. This is some of the stuff that you need to think about when you are hiring someone to create your artwork. What kind of curb appeal does it have? Is it really drawing people's attention? Is it simple? And this really is. We know the name of it. We know who produces it. Common Sense produces it. It's really nice artwork. Okay, one of the things that I'm starting to notice is people using pictures or their photo on their podcast artwork. And you can certainly do that. If you've got a great picture of you, it could be a funny picture, it could be a more serious picture. If it helps audiences relate to you and make them click on your podcast, more power to you. I think you should use it. It does need to be a high quality file, so don't use anything that's pixelated, but you can certainly, share that with the graphic designer and see if they think it would work. But it can go a long way in building that trust and getting people to click on your podcast artwork to listen to your show. So just scrolling through here a little bit, one thing that I noticed, this artwork right here for the Driven Entrepreneur, I guess it's Matt Brawning, but I can't read that at all. And this is a pretty big artwork, right? Because it's pretty big on the page. If I was trying to view this on my phone, there's no way that I'd be able to see it. So keep in mind the text the fonts that you're using. In addition to your podcast artwork, you will have the ability to create specific artwork or a graphic for each episode you upload as well. So you have your main podcast artwork, and that's what shows up when people search for your podcast. But then you can also have graphics that go along with each episode. And what a lot of podcasters do is they'll create something that kind of matches their main podcast artwork. Maybe it uses the same colors, but in the individual episodes, maybe they'll have a picture of the expert for that episode, or they'll grab a stock image that best represents that episode, and maybe they'll put the name of the podcast or the episode title. Maybe they'll put that on the graphic as well. If you're going to create other graphics for your podcast, I would just say make sure there's a common thread between all the graphics that you're creating. You should be able to look at graphics and know exactly what podcast it came from.